How much is too much masturbation? I want you to actually sit with that question for a second, because that question assumes that the problem is some magic number. Like there's some invisible line where it suddenly becomes an issue that you're masturbating too much. But the brain doesn't work that way. It's not like that. What you do, the behavior itself, doesn't always define whether something is a problem, because your brain isn't sitting there counting how often something happens. Even though frequency contributes, it's tracking what the behavior is doing for you. So the real question isn't how often, it's why your brain is reaching for masturbation in the first place. This video is brought to you by my HarperCollins published book, Mind Over Explicit Matter. If you're ready to quit porn and reclaim your life mentally and physically, go over to drtrishleigh.com/book. Now we know masturbation is widely considered normal. Sometimes it's even framed as harmless or healthy. And the cultural conversation is almost entirely focused on permission, not patterns. So people stop questioning it. And what very few people look at is how the brain adapts to masturbation over time. Because something that starts as expression can very quietly shift into dysregulation. And once that happens, you don't need an extreme behavior or some dramatic spike for it to matter. All it takes is repetition, and the brain begins to adapt. Which is why the most important thing to understand here is that normal doesn't always mean neurologically neutral, especially once the brain has rewired or miswired around it. So recently, my handsome son, Declan, he'd kill me for saying that, did a live that was supposed to be 1 week long, but unfortunately I ended up in the emergency room. But here I am, alive and well. But Declan made a comment that just engaging in prepping for the live and then doing the live every day with consistency changed him. He made the comment that it was increasing his work ethic by the day. This is a picture of he and I during, of course it was the crazy hair day, during one of our live sessions. Before this experience, difficult or more challenging for Declan became super easy. This kid was working hard most of the day. He was skipping his gym trips, which he never misses a gym trip. But don't worry, he got his gym trips in. But the idea is that he started doing this with consistency. It wasn't a super high dopamine producing intense activity. It was the regularity of it that helped him ease into this pattern. Now, of course, this is a healthy pattern of work. What we're talking about here is not. Here, we're talking about frequency of a masturbation habit, which is self-soothing, which leads us to the next question. The next question is why? Why do you need masturbation? Now, most people don't understand they are being pulled back to it. It's a compulsion. But what starts to happen in their real life is that the role of the behavior begins to change. It's no longer just something that you can occasionally engage in. It becomes something your brain starts to rely on. So instead of it being a choice, right? Control your brain or it'll control you. It becomes something that you use to fall asleep, to relax, to manage stress, to fill perceived boredom, which is actually lack of overstimulation. And over time, it becomes a default coping tool. And when that happens, real world engagement starts to feel less compelling, not because anything is wrong with you, but because your brain has learned a faster, more reliable way to shift your state. And those are usually the early signs of reliance, no matter the frequency. Because when your behavior starts to regulate your system, that's when the system starts narrowing. So it's usually not about how often, it's about when your brain starts to feel that pull. Because you feel stressed and you go to it. You can't sleep and you go to it. nothing's happening and your mind drifts there anyways. And at first it feels like a choice, like something you're deciding to do. But over time, that shift and what used to feel optional starts feeling automatic. That's where the behavior has turned into a pattern. And patterns are what the brain relies on. They actually learn the patterns. And the pattern that most of my clients' brains have learned is to turn to masturbation to relax, to escape, and to shut down, and to relieve the tension in the system. But of course, if your brain learns to go there repeatedly as a pattern, it's not going to healthy mechanisms to relax, escape, and shut down. So here, my friend, is the miswire. This diagram shows the brain's dopamine system, the circuitry responsible for learning, motivation, and reinforcement, which begins in the ventral tegmental area. You can see it there, VTA. That's where dopamine is released, and it travels into the nucleus accumbens, the part of the brain that processes reward and assigns value to an experience. And when something works to change how you feel, whether it's relieving stress, perceived boredom, or discomfort, that system activates and sends a signal that says that behavior mattered. Do it again. And over time, that signal becomes stronger and faster, reinforcing the pathway each time it's used. And as this loop strengthens, unfortunately, the prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain that's responsible for decision-making, control, impulse control, judgment, it plays less of a role. So the behavior becomes less about conscious choice and more about automatic response. And that's why it starts to feel like your brain is taking you toward masturbation rather than you deciding to go. Now, you know me. I love science. I have the saying in my home that science never sleeps. So let's look at some science together. When we actually look at the research, there isn't a defined number of how much masturbation is too much. Large studies don't show a consistent relationship between actual number and frequency and things like erectile dysfunction or performance. So the idea that there's a specific cutoff point is not supported. But what does matter are factors like stress, mental health, relationship dynamics, and how the behavior is being used. Because in some cases, higher frequency is associated with lower satisfaction. In others, it's neutral. Sometimes it's positive. And the distinction always comes back to the same thing. It's not about specifically how often, it's whether the brain begins to rely on it as a primary way to regulate emotion, relieve stress, or replace other forms of reward. But this graph is startling in and of itself. So yes, this slideshow is about how frequency isn't the only factor, but I want to point out frequency is a factor. You know how I always joke that for every answer I give, there's always another question? Well, this is another case. If we look at this graph together, you can see that 49% of men and 39% of women are masturbating every few days. What does that tell you? Honestly, think about that with your own brain. What does that tell you? It tells us that almost half the population is relying on masturbation. Now, are they relying on it for healthy sexuality and intimacy? No, because evolutionarily, and if you asked any person what kind of sexual relationship they want, most people say they want it with another person. So masturbation is not taking them toward their goal. It's actually taking them away from their goal. So I ask you, in your ideal world, if you were to visualize your ideal sexual life and your ideal intimacy that you could have forever, what would that look like? I doubt it would be masturbation every few days a week. We also see that 30% it's every day, so the vast majority are depending on masturbation. We've got to be clear about this. So repetition of the behavior begins to affect the why. Frequency, some magic number, this magic bullet number, that's not what we're talking about. But frequency matters. And I'll tell you why. Because I have seen it in tens of thousands of brain maps. Now, frequency and repetition matter, and let me tell you why. Because I have seen it in tens of thousands of brain maps. I've actually studied those brain maps in a study that will be out in a top-tier scientific journal sometime soon. I've completed the study, but once I get the writing piece finished. So this is a brain map of what I call drained brain, a pretty significant case of it. Alpha, those medium speeds that are supposed to give you the feelings of calm, they are much too high. They are 99.73% too high. That's how high this level of red is. That is significant dysregulation. It's a significant miswiring in the brain. This is what keeps the brain going back for more and more dopamine from the behavior that it was linked to. This is where we see the core miscalibration happen. Because the brain is repeatedly exposed to higher intensity stimulation, the dopamine threshold begins to increase, which means that normal levels of stimulation start to feel less engaging. At the same time, prefrontal control decreases while the reward system becomes more dominant. And when that balance shifts, the brain becomes more driven by immediate reward and less by long-term regulation in a real-world intimacy situation. This can show up as reduced responsiveness, sexual arousal dysfunction, what I call SAD, or erectile dysfunction patterns. Not because anything is broken in the body, but because the system has maladapted. And when the brain adapts to higher intensity, normal, healthy levels stop being enough. Which leads us to a quote. What you repeat becomes what your brain expects because your response has been trained. Your preferences are learned, and repetition is what defines expectation. So your brain isn't responding to what you believe to be normal. It's responding to what you consistently expose it to, especially when that exposure includes novelty, intensity, and hypersexual content. That's the pattern that it's building around. But of course, there's good news, right? Through the wonders of neuroplasticity, your brain is adaptive in both directions. So this isn't about restriction, it's about recalibration. Because when you reduce intensity, the threshold begins to lower. Real world rewards start becoming engaging again. Sensitivity can return, and the system can move back toward balance, or maybe toward balance for the first time ever. The brain will rebalance when you stop overstimulating it. And that's exactly what I help people do. This is where it gets really interesting because we can actually measure these patterns in the brain. You can see them visually. We can see the difference between overstimulation and regulation. And we can use neurofeedback to train the brain toward balance, improving control and consistency, because you can't change a pattern you haven't seen. And once you see it with your own eyes, you can start to shift it with precision. When the brain starts to rebalance, what you notice isn't something forced. It feels natural. Motivation becomes more stable, focus improves, there's less reliance on stimulation, real-world engagement feels easier and responsive. It returns in a way that doesn't feel effortful. You don't have to force it because when your brain is balanced, it is natural. When your brain works, everything comes online. Let me show you an example from one of my clients. I purposely chose a client that doesn't have a perfect graph. Here, many times, most people have optimized graphs. That's what we're doing here, optimizing brain function. This is a person who has improved significantly, but is still on their way. On this graph, you can primarily see two lines. The red line is high beta, that's stress activation. The purple line is delta, that's a brain that's running too slow. This is the wired and tired brain that pushes you toward masturbation that leads to drain brain that we just saw. In this case, we see the red line decreasing over time and becoming more stable, flatter. We want to see these lines come down, flatten, and begin to organize and stabilize. We see that happening in delta, and there's a nice plateau here, but we still see some spikes. These are some struggles with urges, but the stress activation is down and the urges are decreasing too. So it's not about perfection, but it is about progress. And you can see this is only a few months. This isn't a lifetime. Which leads us to your brain hack strategy for the day, where you can use your mind and your body to start kicking this into gear. Instead of trying to change the habit directly, start by changing your inputs. Reduce novelty, especially from pornography or hypersexualized content. Avoid rapid switching between stimuli. Instead, create a space. Create an environment where you can actually have some thoughts of your own. Slow it down. Give yourself space. I always talk about brain boosting activities, brain neutral activities, and staying away from brain draining activities. Create the space for brain boosting creativity without passively consuming hyper-stimulating content. Then, of course, curate your feed, my friend. It starts there. Clean it up. If it's not motivating you, get rid of it. Remember, your brain is learning why. So I'm going to ask you, why are you going to all the pieces of content you go toward? Every single thing you lay eyes on today, I want you to think this: why am I viewing this? If it's not to motivate yourself to create the life that you want, if it's not moving you forward towards the dream that you have in your heart, adios it. And then, of course, my saying, curate your feed and then call me. Because many people, even after they've curated what they're taking in, don't reverse the effects of the repetition by themselves. That's where the tech comes into place. So, at a certain point, that question of how often I masturbate is a problem, it just goes quiet because you're not managing it anymore. You're not fighting it. It's not taking up space in your mind anymore because your brain isn't being pulled in that direction the way that it used to. And what you start to notice instead is this: it's clarity. It's energy that feels more stable. It's focus that holds on. You feel more present in your life. You can show up in your relationships. You can perform and experience intimacy. You can own your own thoughts. And things that used to feel blah can now start feeling engaging again because you don't have to force them. Your system is no longer overwhelmed. So this isn't about control. This is about coming back into alignment with your nervous system and your brain to function in the way that it was designed. Because this is not about discipline. This is about what your brain has learned and what it can learn instead going to your work, your hobbies, and your relationships for those feelings that your brain's been trained to get from masturbation. So the final shift here is not about how much, it's about how your brain is wired. Because the patterns shape your response, that awareness changes absolutely everything. The awareness that your brain is being trained changes absolutely everything. So here's the picture of Declan and I. We went for Japanese food because he's going to Japan again soon. We went to celebrate the consistency of the work that he was doing to achieve the goals that he set out to achieve, to get the feeling that he wanted from consistent showing up in his work, in his hobbies, the things that he loves, and in his relationships. That's what I want for you. I want you to start asking the right questions. Not about what the magic number is that you can masturbate. Instead, think about how your brain is adapting to that habit. If you are in a position where you want help, please get my book, Mind Over Explicit Matter. It will help. It's a great first step in understanding all the patterns at play here. And then, of course, even better, reach out to me, book an appointment so we can spend private time together. I want you to realize your brain has been trained, but it can be trained to improve and to move back toward that pleasure pathway in your brain and your life that leads you to the life that you want and you deserve. So until next time, please remember, control your brain or it will control you. I'll see you then.